Hello, my name is Alan Groen. I want to tell you a little bit about the Christian Reformed churches that I'm familiar with in the Netherlands, some of their history, and I got onto this because I was baptized in the Christian Reformed Christelijk Gereformeerd, it was called in the Netherlands, in the little village of Heeg in Friesland. Heeg was at that time a village of perhaps 1,500 people, and when I was born there were 3 church buildings in that community: the Roman Catholic St. Joseph's, the Reformed Church, and the Christian Reformed Church. Only the 2 churches now remain, the St. Joseph's and the Reformed Church, the older of the 2 church buildings. It's now called the Haga Church, H-A-G-H-A Church. The story of the Christian Reformed Church and in Heeg and in other communities is very interesting to me. How did it come about that from 2 church buildings in the village to 3? I want to go back quite a ways in history very quickly. If you'd go to the Netherlands in the year 1600, you would have found several church communities. There would have been also the Jewish community, quite a substantial Jewish community, the Roman Catholic community, the Lutherans, and the Protestant or Reformed descendants from John Calvin. I'm interested in the history of the Reformed churches. The churches from 1600 to around 1800 stayed reasonably united, although there was plenty of turbulence that came from a variety of sources. One of the sources was from more liberal theologians from Germany, and many of the Dutch theologians seemed to agree with them. To understand what was happening, you need to understand also that by the year 1800, the French Revolution was beginning to take hold and had a major impact on Western Europe. And without understanding some of that, our understanding of what the churches were all about is kind of incomplete. Shortly after the turn of the century to the year, in the 19th century, the year 1809, King William I was crowned King of the Netherlands. The Netherlands at this part over which he was king was basically just the northern part that we identify as the Netherlands. Now, King William I was very interested in the affairs of the church and got involved in them probably more than he should have. One of the things that he did was to throw out the traditional church order, the rule book for the churches that had been functioning since the Synod of Dort in the 1618-1619, and imposed his own church order, which gave him quite a bit of authority over the churches. The Reformed Church was the state church. It also depended on state finances to function as it should. But it also gave King William I too much authority over the issues like who is going to be your preacher and what will you be allowed to preach and not. So there were penalties involved in not going along with the church order and the demands of King William I. So he imposed this church order, I believe it was in 1816. The churches struggled with that for a number of years. with people actually saying we're just not going to go along with it at all. And so they stopped worshiping with the state Reformed Church and frequently met on their own, although that was illegal. By 1834, the churches had had enough of the interference of the king, and whether they liked it or not, these churches began to worship on their own, often even in fields or in barns, wherever they could gather. Some of the leaders of that group also ended up providing leadership to the Christian Reformed churches in the United States. They immigrated to the United States. So many of the Christian Reformed churches that you meet in the United States of America come from the breakaway that took place in 1834. So in the meanwhile, the Reformed churches just continued with diminished membership because of the breakaway, but they became and became even more so quite liberal in their orientation. So along comes Abraham Kuyper, who was a very important theologian at the straddling the turn from the 19th to the 20th century. Abraham Kuyper wrote voluminously. He became also the Prime Minister of the Netherlands, but his concern had to do with, once he became a more conservative, traditional Protestant Reformed thinker, they found out that there were quite a few people in various places in the Netherlands who all were uneasy with what was happening in the Reformed Church. And so the movement that he started became known as the Dolerende Kerken, which I'll just translate as being the concerned churches of the Netherlands, who kind of united around what Abraham Kuyper was saying. Kuyper went around in many places giving speeches, trying to call people to be more together in a more traditional church, and that got quite a hearing. So also in Friesland, you have by the 1890s, I'm just giving you rough dates here, but quite a few people in the Reformed churches said, we want to join this movement from Abraham Kuyper. So they called a conventicle, they called it. They didn't want to call it synod because they had no formal denomination. They called it conventicle, and many elders and pastors came there and came to quite a bit of an agreement. The elders of the Reformed Church in Heeg said, we think we would like to join that movement. And they had a condition that they attached to it, the elders of Heeg did. They decided that they would join the movement basically on a couple of conditions. One is they wanted the synod, when it was born, to immediately appoint a mission committee. And with that, they also had in mind a committee from the denomination that would collect funds for the poor and needy. And they also wanted the authority for the church to supervise the teachings of the Christian schools. They wanted the right to be able to attend at their impulse what was happening in the Christian schools, because they wanted to make sure that they stayed on the straight and narrow. In Heeg, the community of the traditional Reformed and the concerned Reformed met in what is now called the Haga Church. I mentioned it earlier. It wasn't too long that the traditional Reformed community in that church said, it's all fine and dandy that you folks want to go your own way, but we won't let you in our church building anymore. We want you to make alternative arrangements. Now, the concerned group from that congregation was by far and large the larger group of that church. So when the concerned were dismissed, and when this decision was confirmed by a court case, is that it was the right decision, that the church had the right to ask the concerned to leave their building and take their liturgical elements with them, then they stood on the street, as it were. So very quickly they seem to have gathered funds to be able to build a really substantial church building on the edge of the village. They signed 2 contracts, one with the architect Geert Kuipers to design and oversee the construction of a very substantial church building, and secondly, they signed a contract with the organ builder Lammert van Dam to build an organ that was to be ready to go when for the first service in the new facility. Now, Van Dam designed the instrument but did not actually build it. That was by Bakker and Timminga, who were organ builders in Leeuwarden. They actually built the building. So the church services began. The church would accommodate, my guess would be around 1,000 people. And as a boy, I remember seeing all these people walking to church, because bicycling and horse and carriage was not really what you did unless you were quite far away. Then you could maybe take a horse and carriage to go to church. So this church seemed to have thrived until well after the Second World War. During wartime, people looked to the church for comfort and guidance, and well, you understand that. So I was baptized in that church, a very conservative church, in a few days before Hitler invaded the Netherlands. By the time you get around 1948, you will find that people were talking about immigrating. I remember on a Sunday when I was perhaps 8 years of age that the pastor, whose name was Heeg van Koningsveld, announced that they would be saying farewell to a family from the church because they were immigrating to Australia. But that was in the air. My parents talked about that as well. I believe my father thought that in the Netherlands, his growing family, the boys especially, would be unable to find a decent job in the Netherlands because the 40s were still very poor in the Netherlands. So gradually immigration took place. My parents left in 1951, but a good number of others left as well. Then you have something different happening in the Netherlands, and I was not personally part of it, but I realized what was happening there. The church had good things about it. The teachings of Abraham Kuyper, for example, that the kingdom of our God was to have its power and influence and blessing on all aspects of life, not just the church or the school, but everywhere. Not one square inch could be omitted from that. Also, Abraham Kuyper, to his great credit, after he became president of the Netherlands, advocated universal public health care, and that indeed the Parliament voted for that. But there were also more difficult things that people began to experience. The theology was too rigid. All you need to do was be able to recite the traditional theology, and you didn't need to think any thoughts of your own. In fact, that was probably not a good idea, to think thoughts of your own. So the strictness also manifested itself in things like you were not allowed to play cards. You could play games that had cards with them, but not cards as we think of it. The stores, of course, were closed. My father and mother ran a bakery. The bakery had a display window, and any goodies that were still in the display window at closing time on Saturday had to be removed and papered. They papered the window over so that you could not see what might be there. Sunday was very rigidly observed. I now call that almost a Sabbatarian attitude to Sunday. Well, that was difficult to maintain, so that you have in the Netherlands kind of a rebellion against that, something like the rebellion that you find in Quebec against the Roman Catholic Church. It was called the Silent Rebellion in Quebec, and I think something like that happened in our village and many other communities as well. So people walked with their feet, they voted with their feet, and fewer people came to church. So eventually there were no more 2 services in the church, but 1. And not long after that, there were only 1 service between the 2 churches, then the Hervormed Kerk, the Reformed Church, and the Christian Reformed Church. I worshipped in that building in '84, and a church that might have seated 1,000 people might have had 40 people or so attending. So that was a sad scenario to see. It only got worse, so that in, let's say, the late 2010s, and the discussions began, what do we do with this building? Because they couldn't maintain the building. It didn't make any sense to have 2 churches, each 20 or 30 people. So the decision was made to close the Ichthus Church, which is its name, which means fish church by that time. They closed it, and shortly thereafter they put it up for sale, and a contractor from somewhere in Drenthe, I believe, bought the building, and he said, I want to buy it and I want to turn it into an apartment block. Well, the powers that be thought that was fine, except they were not allowed to change the beautiful facade of this facility. That was often the requirement when churches were sold. You either take it down or you have to maintain the facade. Well, the building was a sound structure, and now when I'm talking about this, they're very close to completing the building and letting it become an apartment building. Probably 7 apartment buildings in that facility. So the church was born in the 1890s, and it passed away, to put it that way, in the late 2010s, early 2020s. Now I'm telling you this partly because this was not the only congregation in the Netherlands that has shared a similar fate, born approximately the same time and departing this earthly life, I guess, in the 1970s to the 2010s. Heeg is located about 10 kilometers, a short distance from Sneek. In Sneek, the same concerned Doliancy churches were built 4 church buildings. My grandfather was an elder in what they call the Southern Church, the Zuiderkerk, but there were 3 more, also an Ichthus Church, and a Noorderkerk, a Northern Church, and a church on the east side of town, and 3 good-sized church buildings. They all met the same fate. These 4 churches in Sneek no longer function. Some of the buildings are there, some not. And now if you're a Protestant church, you would, if you wanted to go to church, you would go to the traditional ancient Martini Kerk, the Church of St. Martin, which was in the center of the city, built in the 12th century, well maintained. But that church building also was forbidden to do anything much with it, so the community has been building some educational facilities and meeting facilities around the St. Martin's Church. In her notes, my mother wrote fondly of an Amsterdam church. It was called the Funenkerk, and that's spelled F-U-N-E-N. It got its name after the park in Amsterdam by that name. That church was a beautiful structure. It was famous in its day for being a beautiful building in Amsterdam. But it was also torn down in about 1975, and you now find a big apartment block where the church used to be. So that's some of the stories that I wanted to share, because the American immigrants, as I mentioned, came from the breakaway in 1834. Most of the Canadian churches were most of the Canadian Christian Reformed churches came from that movement of Abraham Kuyper, with his emphasis so that the immigrants began to form organizations like the Christian Labor Association of Canada, as well as political organizations that are still functioning to this day in Canada. So that's more the Kuyperian model than the other model from 1834, the model of separation from the churches. So I think, and I worry a bit about that the churches that started with the Christelijk Gereformeerde churches and their confessions of faith, that is diminishing in Canada, in our churches here. The churches the Christian Reformed churches of Canada are quite different from the Christian Reformed churches that I remember as a teenage boy from Bowmanville, Ontario, and now a retired pastor in the Christian Reformed Church. So my hope is that this is a helpful reflection that helps us to identify a little bit of who we were and who we are. If you listen to this, thanks a lot.